Morning, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the AI Summer School from DatNexa. And today we're looking at procurement and risk for AI projects. This was probably the hardest session for me to write, to be honest with you, because it's something that we've seen in different ways over the years, and it's not something that is as spoken about as it should be. And I think there's a bit of ickiness sometimes when it comes to commissioning, procurement, contracting, money, time, resources. But it's actually really important because AI has changed a lot of the way that I'm not going to say should, but could approach this stuff. Yeah, any thoughts, questions, queries on this? I'm really interested to hear, and any feedback on the session itself would be lovely. But without further ado, it was interesting in kind of looking at some of the research as to why this matters. Is the kind of the lay of the land that we're seeing across. So this is kind of like public sector and central gov is kind of the focus of a lot of the reports. So only 9% of the government's major technology programs are rated green in terms of the old project plan, which I'm sure some people will be like, but of course. However, it's not a big number. And actually, if only less than 1 in 10 is kind of hitting that point, what is it that's going on? Only 8% have shown measurable benefits in terms of the AI piece. And I think that's something that it can be baked in from the beginning. But really, when you look at these two things, the reason that this is urgent is that the public sector has already awarded over 2,000 AI contracts worth 5 billion quid. So this is the lay of the land. So you can see it's kind of like the system isn't quite worked out yet. There's several things that are areas of concern, and yet the pace is there, the pressure's there. So that's kind of the environment that we're operating within. And I think it's such an interesting one. It's worth kind of digging into what we can all do, not necessarily being in AI or tech or digital or in procurement, but what we can all think about when these things are going through to ensure that we get the best from this technology in our daily working lives. So if there is anyone from procurement in the room as well, would love to have a conversation to get your feedback on this, because I think it's a very interesting emerging area and one of the problems that we're going to have to work out to get the most from AI. As ever, any questions in the chat, and if you want to flag anything immediately, jargony, or just stop and re-explain that point, just hit the surprised face emoji and then it floats up on my screen. Unfortunately, because of my view, I can't see all of you, your lovely faces in the audience, so I'm a bit talking into a void. So if there is anything, do shout, but drop it in the chat and we can kind of pick it up at the end or via email. And just a quick one as to kind of where and why I think we've, kind of DatNexa and the experience that we've gotten is interesting in this space. We've been on both sides of the equation. We've built AI products. We've also helped public sector organizations and third sector organizations procure and manage the build of AI stuff. We've been the poacher, the gamekeeper, and on a couple of occasions, probably the pheasant too. We've built and delivered. We've not just advised. So I think that kind of gives us an interesting perspective. Also, in terms of other work that we've done, kind of specializing in infosec for other major players and primes and stuff like that, we've navigated procurement with about 50 councils. So that's given us a really interesting sort of lay of the land and what's going on. And a lot of what you're about to see is kind of based on that sort of experience. So again, it's kind of like a bit of a weird thing that we've been through. So we kind of want to share the learnings. As I like to say, we've made so many mistakes ourselves, learn from them and go and make some more new mistakes of your own. I think there's a lot to be said for, a lot of this experience has kind of led to the problem delivery model that we look at. And also when it's a lot of stuff, it isn't theoretical. This is based in the real world, the constraints that we've faced, that we've seen our clients face. So this is a little bit warts and all and just working it through that way. So that's kind of us and why we will oblige on you for an hour of your time, if you will. So that all said, welcome to Procurement and Risk for AI Projects. This is the penultimate episode. We have one more on the 10th of September, which is about ethics, governance, and public trust. But today it's about procurement and risk. So before we go into anything about procurement, or maybe the first step of procurement, is making sure that you have the right solution. And this is something with AI, there's a lot of things to pick from. There's lots of different solutions being offered for similar problems. How is it that you can get to the point where you know you're picking the right thing? So a lot of this we've kind of covered off a bit before, but to recap, in week two, we saw this element of things often go wrong when you buy a solution before you clarify the problem. So there's this idea of problem led, not product led, and hopefully never hype led procurement. So really, it's kind of what is it that we're looking at? What is the problem to be solved? Starting with the pain points, so the operational pains, it could be, kind of where you've got backlogs, it could be where you've got demand pressure, it could be where you feel that there's a better technological solution because it's like a repetitive manual task or something like that. This is something that you can also look for the aspirational benefits, but I think the reality of this situation that we're in, you're looking for pain points. In terms of product design, you have this idea of vitamins and painkillers. So if you're making a product, you can be like, well, it's a vitamin, it makes stuff better, or it's a painkiller, it takes rid of pain points. Often, when you're in a constrained situation in terms of resource and there's a lot of work to be done, we're kind of thinking about the painkillers. So what takes that pain away? And that's why we kind of look at this problem-led approach, because I think if you can really define the problem, you're able to come up with the solution that fits best. That's why that clear problem statement is worth a lot more than a kind of a generic framework approach. So really kind of understanding what you want to do with it, what the outcome should look like, who it will affect, and kind of really thinking that in the round gives you a lot of the things that you would need to go through and kind of check against. I think some of the procurement frameworks, which we'll look at later, kind of can offer a false confidence in the fact that they give you a process to go through, but that process does not always necessarily fit with what you're trying to achieve. And AI has done something to undo some of that because it's very different from traditional IT or tech projects. So there is something here where, in the absence of a framework that exactly fits, you need to kind of do that due diligence of defining the problem. If you can't say what success looks like simply in a sentence, then the more work needs to be done. And this is kind of one of those kind of tests that we set. If you're able to simply state what you're up to, and what it will look like when it's done in a way that anyone can understand, then it means that you're more likely, everyone's eyes are on it, everyone gets what you're doing. If it kind of very quickly descends into very technical language that only a few people get the gist of, I think that makes it harder for everyone to kind of go for this shared accountability and shared responsibility. You remember this idea from earlier on that, the best way to get the most from these tools is to have everyone round the table. So if your end stakeholder is kind of baffled by the jargon being used, then that's not good enough. Working out the difference that it makes for colleagues, for residents, for system-wide change needs to be very clearly articulated. Um, the other thing that we're kind of starting to see is this bit between building something new, buying something off the shelf, or reusing stuff that's out there. And I think this is again really interesting because AI has changed the way that you can reuse things, especially. But I think, there is a bit of a tension where, yeah, what you've kind of defined your problem. What is it that you're going to do to fit that gap that you found? So often we're kind of seeing this sort of push for reusable stuff that's already been proven within the sector, that's already in use. And I think that is the cheapest and safest way often to go about this. But let's unpack that a bit more. So there are different ways that you can solve the problem for sure. There's bespoke building, and that's where you kind of, this is what I kind of call like traditional website builds or digital builds or IT builds, where you're going off and you're going through an entire process that starts off with kind of like a full discovery phase, design, a development phase, and then deployment. So in that process, it's like a cycle that takes you from an idea, maybe just the problem statement through to something that's been built especially for you. That is something that, is absolutely worth doing. And it's something, I should say that, we do at Dat Nexa, but it is something that potentially can be more expensive, can be more time consuming, even with, the AI development tools that allow you to condense it. So it's never been cheaper to do, but it's still not cheap. It can be cost effective to do, but it will take time and resource. It will also need support, human support, and everything like that. So it's definitely worth doing if you are doing something for the first time, if you're doing something genuinely, uniquely first time out the gate. And that I think is kind of where a lot of us are because AI is so new. But that's kind of like the big bespoke build. You've then got kind of like the off the shelf stuff, and this is where the products come into it, where there's something that exists, it's a tool that's being used by others. You can take it, you can switch it on, and you can move, kind of move your services into it. And we went through a ton of those in earlier weeks where, you know them, you'll heard of them, you can go and talk to other local authorities using them, other public sector bodies using them. It's the sort of thing that the government's kind of moving into with the tools that they're producing. It's pretty straightforward, and it's kind of using things that they are as they are. And they can be sometimes tailored to your use case, but they do what they do, or they don't. And that is kind of quite a cut and dried piece. So if your problem statement is exactly the same as many other local authorities or many other public sector bodies, you could probably just use that for what they're doing, and it's cheap, it's fast, and you kind of know what you're getting. The other piece is this idea of using reusable products and accelerators. So this is a slightly different bit that fits between these 2 points. These are kind of like, I like to think of them as, like semi-built, but still configurable products that can be fit into a bespoke setup. And this is where we're starting to see a different sort of approach emerging. So that kind of takes a lot of the risk out of the bespoke build, where you're building things for the first time, but it also introduces the flexibility and configuration, ease of configuration of a product. So that's something that kind of sits in the middle and is a new one. And that kind of means that you're kind of looking at something that's already being used in situ somewhere else, but you're then able to take it where you need to use it. And those are the things that we've been exploring a lot within the AWS ecosystem, because that's something where you can kind of use these repeatable patterns and tools. There are equivalents within all major flavors of tech provider. And I think it's a very interesting space because also it can build up your in-house capacity to kind of like own, administer, and kind of build expertise within this world. Whereas a bespoke build, you're probably going to end up relying too much or too often on developers. And with a product, there's only a finite amount that you can kind of change. So I think kind of overall, there's a lot of stuff going on. I've just spotted a hand for a question. If you want to drop it in the chat, what we'll do is fire through and come back to it a bit later on, if that's okay. Cool, wicked. So that's kind of like the lay of the land as we're seeing it, and I think it's an interesting dynamic that is changing as we go through. But ultimately, there's a few things that we need to kind of focus on, which is going for the right tool for the right job. And I think here you've kind of got a few different sorts of things. You have these large language models out there that are kind of looking at the, kind of like complex reasoning, or, like taking a transcript and turning it into summaries that are then used for a report. They're kind of very good at that broader stuff. You've got these smaller models which are kind of looking at, well, we're within a constrained world, so the solutions are only likely to come from like a handful of different places. um, you're looking at these bigger tools that then kind of go out and can do things on the back, so they go beyond kind of AI as we've seen it, that's kind of synthesizing a report or doing something like that, into perhaps sending an email or carrying out a booking or something like that. And these are these kind of like agentic pieces. There's also kind of now an orchestration piece, which is something that's clever enough to understand what's going on and then refer you to the right agent. So that's another sort of tool. And then, even though you've got all of these different sorts of AI that you can kind of work through, there is some things that still are required, that still absolutely have to be human. So things that are like judgment calls, validation, anything where there's that accountability in terms of the work that we do. Perhaps they shouldn't be automated at all. So I think it's really just thinking about the sorts of tools you have in front of you and making sure you're using the right tool for the right job. Now, kind of that statement on the right there is kind of saying, well, there's a risk and there's a cost associated to the complexity of the tool that you're using. So always really look at what you're up to and go for the lowest, most reliable, lowest cost, lowest risk, most reliable tool that you can. It may be that over the course of time you want to move up to a more complex tooling or something like that, but do always default to that lower cost, lower risk piece first, because that will give you the stability and kind of like it'll give you the impact in the first instance, but it'll also give you a great place to see, do you want to move up to a more powerful tool and kind of make a good assessment. It allows you to baseline at that point. The other piece, just to kind of flick back to week one, was this idea of the domains of AI. So when you're thinking about commissioning a tool or procuring a tool, we had these different levels. We had personal efficiency, department level, organizational wide, and then of course our customers are using AI too. So in this instance, it's always worth thinking about which of these boxes does the thing that I'm procuring fall into. And if it is something that is using a personal efficiency tool for organizational wide work could go wrong. Using a department level tool for personal efficiency may work, may not work. So it's really thinking about how and where your tool is deployed. And it's this idea of contextually putting the right thing in. So, if you were to allow your customers access to your Copilot, for instance, that would be a total nightmare because you'd have residents who are able to sweep through all of the internal files. You wouldn't want to do that. Similarly, if you gave your public-facing chatbot to a member of staff, it wouldn't have the detail they need to do their job. So you can see how these things work. Also, a tool that was designed for the legal team may not work for the finance team, or adult social care may not work for children's. There's a lot of stuff that falls into that sort of category. So I think thinking through all of these different sorts of bits that we've learnt already to just really understand the problem, the context of what you're trying to do, the options of the types of things. Is it a project, a bespoke build, or is it a product? Is it something in between? And also, where does it fit? Helps you give that clarity that you need to take forward into the next bit, which is kind of like working out what the spec is, talking to suppliers, talking to vendors, and really kicking the tires of what they're talking about. So that's the picking the solution. Next, we're on to procurement. And I think, there's a lot of this is a bit of a hot topic. And I think there's a lot being said about, how procurement works. And, certainly the government is saying they want to use different sorts of suppliers. Suppliers are saying it's too hard to go through the processes. That's something that's going on. I think there's a lot of information about that. What I wanted to dig into is some of the bits that I think we've started seeing because of our perspective. So this is just focusing on some of the emerging areas that I think we all need to be aware of, and it's a bit of a health and safety warning section. This, it's really what it is kind of like I think being aware of these stops these problems happening. So this, the pitfalls that we've seen in procurement so far. I do also really want to say this is about procurement systems and frameworks, not the people who are working in procurement who have even in very normal times really challenging worlds to navigate. But there's a lot of stuff being going on in the wider public sector. There's been a lot of changes, but also AI is something. It's a highly fast-moving situation, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And we've worked with many, many, many procurement people who are absolute rock stars, getting their heads around it whilst having a very busy day job as well. So this is kind of like systematic stuff that we think is worth calling out. And also, it means that the more we talk about it, the more everyone around the table can start thinking about these things, because it's not just a procurement person's job to think about all this stuff. So that's kind of the caveat for this bit, but hopefully some interesting stuff. So the problem that kind of has been identified by people like Tech UK, Startup Coalition, and things like that is that the traditional procurement cycles and frameworks are kind of structurally mismatched to the way that AI works. So when you look at technology and IT, they used to be really big, slow-moving beasts. Now you've got this other approach, which is AI moving very quickly in very short iterative loops. So this kind of shakes loose in a few different ways. First off, the idea of like a spec, a fixed spec with requirements is really hard to do now. So it used to be, like 10 years ago, building a website, you would be able to very firmly spec exactly in quite technical language what you wanted from the site, because a site was a site was a site. Whereas now it's far harder to do that with AI when you've got changes coming along so quickly. I think the interesting part with something like this is that there's an opportunity there to really kind of push the technology further by not specifying it as closely, as long as you can be assured that what you're getting is fit for purpose. And that's where the problem statement comes in, because it kind of really gives you a very firm, clear way of articulating what it is that you want. But that's not, where procurement big frameworks are, where they're expecting large lists of requirements to be mapped against. And sometimes it's impossible to kind of really clearly articulate them because the nature of the technology is not known well enough in terms of the requirement drafting teams. So that's like a real clash that's starting to emerge. It can then also be tricky to kind of scrutinize how AI vendors are operating, how the models work. There's a lot of stuff going on within that one box. And, if you're working, everyone who's on this call is kind of has a very busy day job as well. So really, it's kind of like, how do we work out the ways to explain, talk about, different sorts of commercial models, different ways of selling AI, buying AI, in a way that kind of gets the best value from the public purse, but then also kind of gives you the most control in determining those contracts. The next one is a little bit philosophical, but like really important. And we've kind of seen this a few times in that a lot of the large enterprise, like big IT or technology providers, want to sell AI in a horizontal way. And that is a way of kind of saying they want to sell in across an entire organization at the top. So that's where you would buy a load of licenses for Microsoft Copilot, for instance. But actually, what we're seeing is a lot of the value from AI comes from the contextual application of that technology to your world, to your department, to your team, to your residents, to the people you serve. And those are verticals sitting underneath this horizontal slab. So there is something going on at the moment where, things that are brought in and kind of put in at the very top level need that support vertically, and teams need the support to apply it. So it's kind of like once something is bought, the adoption is as key as the initial procurement of it. And that's something that really squeezes the most value out of the AI. So it's worth thinking about how do you embed that as you go forward. And again, this is a very different sort of concept that is not always embedded within the larger frameworks and is often being led by procurement teams and colleagues who are working kind of like in a more like individual way. So I think understanding that and sharing that is really important. um, the other piece is like some of the qualifications to get onto frameworks are designed for larger firms, for primes, for the kind of like big setups that have big teams who perhaps just focus on procurement or compliance or things like that. And there are a lot of smaller firms that are out there doing great work that, don't meet all of those criteria. And that can be like like a loss of value potentially. That's something that I think a lot of stuff's being written on by people like the Startup Coalition, so I won't get into that. But I think it is an interesting element because a lot of those smaller firms are more focused on over delivering on value because that's kind of where they are in their cycle. So I think that's another interesting sort of dynamic to look at. There is something about this adoption piece that I think is worth thinking about, but also the entire life cycle of the product. And with AI, that's tricky because it is so new. It's not like we can look at an AI system that's been in place for 5 years and go and talk to colleagues in another organization that have been using it for a decade. So there is a bit of imagineering that we have to do with this sort of stuff. But considering the entire life cycle helps deliver more value when you're procuring stuff. So there are things that we've seen before, like vendor lock-in. So when you're kind of commissioning these tools, thinking about how can you get your data out, what's the logic going into it, how much of what you're relying on is in a model that's hidden away, or can you actually see that your logic, the context that you're putting into it, is available for you to kind of look at, amend, take away with you. And that's really important to work out how you would exit that product. If there's no alternative to exit to, then you're kind of locked in with them. Or if it's so painful to leave, that you never will. You're locked in with them. And that's something that's happened with existing systems. So I think that's definitely worth calling out when you kind of start a new relationship. There's the same piece, which is knowledge lock-in, which is, do you really understand how it works? Do you want to understand how it works? How much can you manage of that in-house? And is there a dependency relationship being built up there? And at the moment, you can see kind of like with design of AI tools, the difference between those that are kind of doing a lot of stuff on the developer side, so it has to be done by a developer, versus those who are doing it more on the content side or the configuration side, so it can be done more by the client. And this is something that I think, again, is kind of it's a bit of a spectrum, and then it'll wax and wane over the course of the next few years. Scaling shock is a really good one to call out, which is it, especially in the pilot through to adoption phase. And this is the fact that it costs money to move from a pilot through to everyone using it, but it may not be, cash that's transferred to another organization. It's actually staff time. It's kind of like the overhead. It's the work not being completed whilst people are learning new systems. And that's something that really needs to be factored into that original business case or put onto the supplier as kind of like, well, how do you manage adoption of this to get as many people using it as possible? And again, I think this is something that we've seen in other setups, but it's definitely worth calling out at the beginning. And then the other part of it is governance debt. So this idea of once it's been through that first wave of assurances through the procurement process, who owns that over time? And how will they kind of fold that into an existing workload? So, that could be things like making sure that the lights are on, that it's using, if it's a large language models, it's using the best model, it's using the cheapest model, it's using the most cost effective model, who's accountable for it, and all of these different pieces. A lot of it, again, all of this stuff is often factored into different areas, but it's just worth calling out because AI has a tendency of knocking down quite a lot of walls between different silos and also blending stuff together. So I think these are all things just to think about at the initial commissioning, just to get the most from it. There is something that we've seen more of in recent years, and this is largely based on our expertise in working in the kind of like the compliance across information governance, data protection, and cybersecurity. And often you kind of see this as information governance colleagues, data protection colleagues, and cybersecurity, often within IT colleagues. And these are interlinked disciplines that, there's overlap between them. And it varies from organization to organization as to who does which bit of a procurement or due diligence piece. What we're beginning to see is that there's also another element, which is an AI risk that sits in between all of them. And it's something that is worth calling out because we've seen it like a couple of elements of it. But I guess what I'm saying here is that if you end up with those different areas being owned by different people with different policies and the overlap is not being examined fully, there is a risk that something will slip through. That can be seen in kind of, so we've kind of come up with a fictionalized, this isn't anything real, but it's very close to a few things that we have seen. The idea that you may have a legacy system that is a CRM or a database or something storing things. And that's sat there and it's kind of quite happily being used to manage caseload or asset management or something like that. That is then repurposed during an AI tool delivery, where actually the AI tool has been kind of picked out, commissioned, procured, and will use the data that's in the system. There may be a bit where actually what we're doing is kind of looking at each individual element, looking at an individual aspect of the AI tool, that things like not flagging that the original data set was perhaps not as strongly representative as it appears. It could be that the basis for using the tool, the legal basis for using this tool was based on an assumption that actually the data was fit for purpose. And then the system is secure because they've met all of the cybersecurity essentials and kind of like all of the principles that are laid out by the National Centre for Cybersecurity. All of those boxes are absolutely ticked. However, you end up in a place where there's a tool that will underserve or discriminate the people who are in the underrepresentative areas. So it kind of compounds this sort of digital discrimination, digital exclusion piece. This is the sort of thing that, because you kind of came along and did the session last week, you know that you'll be looking at the outcomes as well as the tool, and then you'll be looking at the outcomes, and all of a sudden it'll be flagged that, hang on, there's something not right here, there's a degree of bias in the system, and then you'll be going back in to see what's going on. But this is a good example of the sort of thing that can end up inadvertently skewing or biasing a system when those three areas aren't really, kind of interrogated backwards and forwards across the board. And that's something that we've kind of seen, and it's not an immediate obvious thing. So I think it's definitely something that's worth flagging up and kind of thinking about, especially in an AI context, in order to prevent negative outcomes later on down the line. The other thing that's very new in terms of AI is this idea of agentic AI. And again, this is something it's very new. We're working on something at the moment that's kind of led to us thinking about these sorts of things. So again, just really want to flag up quickly as a heads up that if you are thinking about this, how does this fit in and what are the answers here? Again, in terms of answers, love to hear more because I think we've got quite a lot of questions. But the idea here is agentic AI is something that's able to go off, it can plan things, it can act, it can take out many steps on its own, which means it's a different way of kind of thinking about the tool that's being used. It's probably not like procurement, it's probably closer to something like HR, where you're thinking about, we're going to put someone in who's going to do these tasks. How do we assure that they will then do these tasks when they're given the autonomy to do so? So for agentic AI, there's a few areas that definitely need to be thought about. One is the privilege. So what can it go and see? What can it do? And actually, with all of this stuff, again, going for the low risk option first, don't give it godlike access to everything on your systems. Really lock it down and build it up from there. How will it behave? What's its prompt or like mega prompt in the background? And what's it using as its brain? Which system is it using? And if that model changes, have you got assurance that you will still get the same outcomes? A lot of you will have heard stuff about like, oh, they've upgraded ChatGPT and now it does something totally different. Well, that's annoying if you're the end user, but if you've got that baked into a system somewhere, what could potentially change and how do you make sure you keep an eye on that? What does it do in practice? How does it map to its original kind of instructions? And how do you quality assure that or monitor that going forward? Where is it embedded into your systems? And actually, where is it interacting? And this is where things like knowing where it's gone, but also seeing things like the audit logs, the decision logs, and what it's doing and why it's doing it become key. There's also a big question of accountability, which is nothing to do with the technical implementation, all to do with us as humans, which is, what happens when it gets something wrong? How do we make sure that it doesn't do that? But if it does, who is accountable and what steps of remediation are in place to kind of solve that? As you can see, this is kind of really quite a long way away from a list of requirements given to a supplier to deliver on and then hand over. There's a lot of kind of new bits emerging from this. And I think kind of it just gives everything that we're looking at in terms of procurement a different flavor, but also in terms of managing risk, there's a lot bundled up in this. So being able to understand these as first principles really helps you, I guess, understand what's going on in order to best mitigate it. So that's kind of like the more health and safety bit of the conversation. But don't worry, there's a lot of like, I don't know, doom and gloom, but those are the bits that we've seen are really important things to think about that you kind of do square off. But you absolutely have this, and there's a lot of things that you've learnt already that will help you navigate it. And there are also ways that you can think about this to take it forward. Remember, we want to do this as a means of like, if everyone understands these sorts of issues, then you've got a lot of brains working on it. And ultimately, AI is great, but still, the most effective, complex piece of technology you have in your possession sits between your ears here. So this is really, how do we take what we've learned and mitigate these issues? So there's a lot of things that you know already. Buying AI is absolutely applying everything that we've gone through in the past few weeks. So week one, the idea of like matching the AI type to the task, that it fits the job is, absolutely, there's tons of stuff in there. Making sure that context is defined and worked out gives you the most value. So, kind of really thinking about how do you make it work for your world and what do you need to ask a supplier, a colleague, or do yourself to make the AI do that. In week 2, looking for the green flags of what you want in a supplier and how they work and what they're thinking about and how they can support you in your job as the primary focus, not you help them build a better AI. And I think that's kind of like a key part. Week 3, the whole point about data, garbage in, garbage out. No procurement framework, colleague, IT colleague, data governance, data protection colleague can solve the bad data issue on their own. They can flag it out, they can come up with mitigations, but also working as a team to really understand what's there and how to get the most from it and how to improve it is everyone's job. And this idea of going from a foundation to acceleration to adoption. So looking for the problem, looking at the data, really working that through, looking at how you can speed stuff up, and then doing adoption as a definite stage of the work that you're up to get rid of that pilot shock piece, and to really make sure that people are using the tool as much as possible, as early as possible, so you can get the most benefit from it. So all of these things are, kind of issues that we've brought up. What's new today and how to apply it is a slightly different piece. There isn't a playbook, a cut and dyed playbook for this. And actually, if there was, it would probably be changing once every couple of months. But I think things like, showing that you've thought about it and you've tried to assess the broadest range of things going on in terms of risk and also in terms of tool selection and thinking through why you're going what you're going for from as many angles as possible as well. So I think that's where diverse design, from a frontline, from a resident, from an end service user, from IT, from digital, from, the C-suite. There's a lot to be said for all these different views. And being able to say, well, this is why we did what we did and have that as a defensible position is really key. Asking those sorts of 5 questions of agentic AI, that's a very new thing, so definitely worth thinking about. And if any of you are going down that route and you would like just a quick call about that, please never hesitate to drop us a line. We would generally find it interesting, but also if there's anything we can share that helps you move faster or avoid a problem, that is an absolute key part of what we do. Understanding that link between information governance, data protection, and cybersecurity, and figuring out for what you're doing where it sits and is there anything that could slip through that hole in the middle. Having someone who owns that kind of like area is really useful as well. Thinking about what the one sentence test is, the one sentence success, what is it you're doing and can you explain it simply? That's super useful. And again, a key thing to kind of move on. Working out the life cycle up to exit before you sign means that, you wouldn't want to exit because you're just procuring it. But knowing that you could, what you would have to do, I think kind of really keeps everyone honest in that scenario and also may help inform the initial delivery of that tool. So that's kind of like the bits that we've done. And we've kind of thrown these into just a 5 kind of point AI readiness checklist. And AI helped me with a nice logo, which is very Robocop. Now I look at it. So, problem clarity. Can you state the problem in a sentence? Have you matched the right type of AI to the actual task? Data readiness. Is your data accurate, owned, accessible, and tested before you commit? And if it isn't, is there, kind of a roadmap to get that done? And, perfection is the enemy of done, but I think calling it out is definitely worth doing. The governance overlap, has that happened? Has that happened? And have we looked at it from that point of view? And also, kind of are there other elements that perhaps need to be added into that Venn diagram for the particular tool that you're looking at? Procurement and risk. Are you buying reusable over bespoke where possible? Is there an exit plan? Are you doing the proportionate kind of risk check all the way through? You're not going for anything that's kind of introducing high levels of risk where it isn't needed. And also remember, high risk things often mean high cost things. So there's a real public sector value piece of going for the right setup. Trust and oversight. Is there a human checkpoint? Is there ongoing monitoring? Is there an internal capability to manage this once it's gone live? And actually, how will it blend with your teams going forward? So these are kind of like the five kind of big areas to think about. And I think especially with our procurement hats on, because it is different to the existing frameworks and what's happening at the moment. So that's kind of the overall look at it. I'll just quickly just run through next time and then we can jump into questions. Um, Next time is not next week, the week after, and we're looking at ethics, governance, and public trust. And the reason that this one comes last is that I think a lot of the things that we've spoken about kind of hinted towards these elements. But this is kind of key in establishing what you need. The public trust, I think, is key because high levels of trust in a tool will mean that it's being used. If you may have the best tool in the world, but if no one trusts it, um, it won't get used. So this is kind of like the final bit that we're building up to. So looking forward into the issues there. And that's the next one. As ever, we will be putting the playlist together and sending slides on the back of all of the sessions. And that is it for this bit. I will just come back to the chat and see if we have any questions and things like that. I can see some things are going on. Okay, cool. I will just quickly do the questions. If anyone's got any more, drop them in the chat or put your hands up. Shanjun, for document draft automation review, thoughts on a company organization, self-hosting an LLM in-house and tailoring it to their own needs in terms of owning everything in-house, or is that a non-starter? I think with that, the document that's being drafted is pretty key. If you're looking at something that's kind of using a lot of personally identifiable information, that is something that you may wish to keep closer or in-house or within your own tenancy within a provider's account. So in-house need not mean that you've kind of got, kind of like boxes in the building. It could be that it's a bit of a private cloud. It could be within a Google Cloud Platform account, an AWS account, something like that. It would really be what are you drafting and kind of like how important is it that that information stays in-house? If it was highly sensitive information in both the source documents and what was being drafted, that would certainly push you more in that direction. I think also looking at the model and so the model's hosted in-house as well. I think that also can be, there's definite benefits to that again, if you're kind of looking at something that's very highly like classified, for instance. With that, though, I think it's all about that ongoing life cycle piece that you need to look at. So once it's been done, if it is done there, how will you ensure that it works over time, it's kept updated, and kind of like the ongoing maintenance, and is there a commitment to that spend over time? One of the benefits of going out to a supplier is, especially for the product, is they've wrapped everything like ongoing maintenance, upgrades, security, account management, people coming up with new ideas, roadmap, all into one price that you can pay. So it gives you very definite budget stability. It may be that if you do it in-house, you're going to end up dealing with peaks and troughs in terms of usage and stuff like that. So I think it's not that it's a non-starter. I think there's just a few more questions to flush out. And if you want to drop us some more details, happy to give you a sense of what that looks like, and if it is something, if there are any viable alternatives, happy to point you in the right direction. Cool. That is that. Are there any other questions? No? In that case, we can wrap there and return 10 minutes to everyone's day. As ever, the slides will be, we'll do like an edited highlight of the slides, and the recording will be available very quickly, thanks to Joe. Otherwise, have a lovely day, enjoy the rain, and I will see you all in 2 weeks, hopefully for the final session of the summer school. Thanks a lot.